They can also recognize faces and can hold a grudge against someone who was rude to them for several years.
The moment scientists pointed an advanced AI at thousands of hours of crow calls, they expected nothing more than organized noise. Maybe the system would separate alarm calls from feeding calls or identify different vocal patterns that had taken researchers years to classify by ear. Instead, the AI uncovered something no one had seriously expected. Hidden beneath the harsh caws and raspy clicks was evidence of structure. Patterns repeated with remarkable consistency. Certain sounds appeared only after others. Some combinations completely changed their meaning depending on the order they were delivered. It looked less like random bird noises and more like the basic framework of a language. That discovery raised an unsettling possibility. What if crows weren't simply making sounds to express emotion? What if they were exchanging information in ways humans had barely begun to understand? And when researchers dug even deeper, they stumbled across something even stranger. Much of what these birds appeared to communicate wasn't focused on predators or food sources. It was about us. For generations, people have dismissed crows as noisy scavengers that happen to be intelligent. But modern research is painting a completely different picture. These birds don't simply live alongside humans. They watch us. They recognize us. They remember us. And in ways scientists are only beginning to uncover, they may even share information about us with other crows. It's enough to make you wonder how many times you've walked beneath a telephone wire while a bird silently watched, already knowing exactly who you were. Researchers studying crow behavior weren't trying to decode a language in the beginning. Their original project was far more modest. Across several study sites, scientists placed recording equipment in parks, forests, and urban environments where crows regularly gathered. Directional microphones quietly collected thousands upon thousands of hours of vocalizations. The idea was simple. Feed everything into machine learning software and let artificial intelligence sort similar sounds together. Humans had spent decades trying to categorize crow calls manually. Alarm calls, territory disputes, food discoveries, family interactions. It was painstaking work. AI promised to finish in days what would otherwise take years. For nearly 2 weeks, the system analyzed the recordings non-stop. When the first results appeared, the researchers expected neat categories. Instead, the software highlighted something completely unexpected. Rather than grouping sounds randomly, it consistently detected underlying rules governing how individual vocal elements fit together. Certain sound units almost never appeared beside others. Some sequences reversed their apparent meaning simply by changing their order. In human language, we call those kinds of organizing rules syntax. For generations, syntax had been considered one of humanity's defining characteristics. Animals certainly communicated, but scientists generally viewed those signals as instinctive responses rather than structured language. A dog barked because it felt threatened. A cat hissed because it was afraid. Complex grammar seemed uniquely human. Yet the AI repeatedly identified statistical patterns suggesting crow communication followed predictable structural rules. Researchers reran the analysis. Then they repeated it again. Each time the same patterns emerged. No one was claiming that crows spoke English or possessed human language. But the possibility that their communication contained organized structure forced scientists to reconsider assumptions that had remained largely unquestioned for decades. The project had started as an exercise in organizing sounds. It was quickly becoming an investigation into intelligence itself. Then another discovery made everything even harder to explain. During one observation period, cameras recorded a man wearing a distinctive red cap walking through one of the monitored parks. A nearby crow called out. To every person nearby, it sounded like nothing unusual. Just another crow making another harsh cry. The AI, however, treated that vocalization differently. Instead of placing it inside a familiar category, it assigned the sound its own unique acoustic signature. Several days later, the same man returned. The same crow produced an almost identical call. That alone wasn't particularly shocking. Plenty of animals recognize familiar individuals. But about a week afterward, something happened that caught everyone's attention. The original crow wasn't even present. Instead, another crow perched elsewhere in the park produced virtually the same distinctive vocal pattern when the man appeared. According to tracking data collected during the study, that second bird hadn't previously encountered him during earlier observations. Researchers couldn't say with certainty exactly what the birds were communicating. Science simply isn't there yet. But the repeated use of one highly specific vocal pattern suggested that individual humans might be associated with consistent vocal identifiers shared among multiple birds. Whether those sounds functioned as something similar to names remains an active area of discussion among researchers. It's an intriguing possibility rather than a settled conclusion. Still, the consistency was difficult to ignore. The more recording scientists examined, the more examples appeared of crows responding differently to particular people, not just to humans in general. If you've ever wondered whether birds can remember faces, the answer is already well established. They can. And they remember remarkably well. One of the most famous demonstrations came from research conducted by behavioral ecologist John Marsluff and his colleagues at the University of Washington. The experiment itself was surprisingly simple. Researchers wore a distinctive caveman mask while briefly capturing several wild crows for harmless tagging before releasing them. On other occasions, they wore a completely different neutral mask while walking through the same areas. The difference in the birds' reactions was dramatic. Whenever the neutral mask appeared, the crows paid little attention. But the moment someone wearing the caveman mask entered the area, alarm calls erupted almost immediately. Birds swooped overhead, followed the researchers, and loudly warned others nearby. That result alone confirmed that crows could distinguish one human face from another. But the truly remarkable part came later. Years passed. Many of the original birds were no longer alive. Yet new generations that had never experienced the original capture still reacted aggressively to the same mask. Somehow, knowledge about a specific dangerous face had spread socially from one group of birds to another and persisted long after the original witnesses disappeared. The findings suggested that important information wasn't simply remembered by individuals. It was passed through crow communities. Scientists have documented similar social learning in several intelligent animals, but crows seem especially skilled at preserving information across generations. Imagine growing up already knowing which humans are trustworthy and which ones should be avoided, all because older members of your community taught you long before you encountered those people yourself. That kind of shared memory dramatically changes how we think about these birds. It also raises another question. How can an animal with a brain roughly the size of a walnut accomplish all of this? For years, people assumed intelligence depended almost entirely on having a large mammalian brain, especially the cerebral cortex, where much of our higher thinking occurs. Birds don't possess that same structure. Early neuroscientists therefore assumed birds simply lacked the biological machinery necessary for sophisticated thought. But later research told a very different story. Instead of looking at outward appearance alone, scientists examined the density and organization of neurons packed inside the avian brain. What they found surprised many researchers. Bird brains are organized differently from mammal brains, yet certain regions contain extraordinarily dense networks of neurons capable of supporting advanced cognitive processing. In other words, evolution solved the problem of intelligence using different biological architecture. The hardware isn't identical, but the results can be astonishingly similar. That helps explain why crows repeatedly demonstrate abilities once believed to belong only to primates. New Caledonian crows, for example, don't merely pick up sticks. They carefully manufacture specialized tools. They cut leaves into hook-shaped implements designed to pull insects from narrow crevices. If one breaks, they'll often modify or repair it instead of starting over. When natural materials aren't available, they improvise with wire or other objects. They're not simply reacting. They're planning. Another famous experiment revealed something equally impressive. Researchers placed food floating inside a narrow tube partially filled with water. Nearby sat several objects. Some were heavy stones. Others were lightweight materials that floated. The birds ignored the floating pieces. Instead, they deliberately selected the heavier stones, dropping them into the tube one after another until the rising water lifted the reward close enough to retrieve. Whether they understood the physics exactly as humans do is still debated. But their behavior clearly demonstrated flexible problem-solving rather than simple instinct. Experiments like these continue challenging old assumptions about what intelligence actually looks like. Perhaps we've spent too long measuring every species against ourselves instead of appreciating the many different ways evolution can produce complex minds. And if crows truly possess this level of cognitive ability, then perhaps it shouldn't surprise us that their social lives are far richer than anyone once imagined. Because once researchers began examining not just how crows think, but how entire flocks share information, the picture became even more extraordinary. As scientists learned more about crow intelligence, one conclusion became increasingly difficult to ignore. These birds weren't simply surviving alongside people. They were constantly studying the humans who shared their environment. One of the clearest examples came from years of field observations showing that crows don't just recognize dangerous individuals. They also recognize kind ones. People who regularly feed neighborhood crows often report unusual behavior over time. Instead of immediately flying away, the birds begin waiting nearby. Some even appear to greet familiar people with softer calls before approaching. Researchers have documented countless cases where crows consistently returned to individuals who had treated them well while avoiding those who had previously threatened them. Even more fascinating are the occasional reports of crows leaving behind small objects. Buttons, shiny beads, bottle caps, tiny pieces of colored glass. Scientists remain cautious about interpreting these behaviors. There's no evidence that crows understand gifts in the same emotional sense humans do. However, many researchers believe these objects may represent social exchanges within a relationship the birds have learned to value. Whether intentional gifts or simply unusual sharing behavior, the pattern appears often enough that it continues attracting scientific attention. It suggests that crows don't simply classify humans as good or bad. They seem to build long-term reputations. That idea becomes even more intriguing when researchers study how crows respond after one of their own dies. Unlike many birds that quickly abandon a dead companion, crows often gather around the body. Dozens may arrive within minutes. Instead of feeding or interacting directly with the deceased bird, they perch quietly in nearby trees. Observers have described these gatherings as surprisingly solemn. For years, many scientists wondered whether the behavior represented mourning. Recent research suggests the answer may be more practical than emotional. Rather than simply grieving, these gatherings appear to serve another important purpose. The surviving crows carefully observe the surrounding environment. What caused the death? Was it a predator? A vehicle? A human? Should this location now be considered dangerous? Experiments have shown that crows become significantly more cautious around places associated with dead members of their flock, sometimes avoiding those areas for extended periods afterward. In other words, every death becomes a learning opportunity. Instead of one bird paying the price alone, the entire community updates its understanding of potential threats. It's an incredibly efficient survival strategy. Knowledge spreads quickly. Mistakes become lessons. Future generations benefit from experiences they never personally witnessed. Researchers have also documented surprisingly complex social behavior within crow groups. Individuals remember cooperative partners. They recognize cheating. Higher-ranking birds often maintain order through social pressure rather than constant fighting. Although it's tempting to describe these interactions using human terms like courts or justice systems, scientists prefer more cautious language. What they can confidently say is that crow societies operate through long-term social relationships where reputation matters. Individuals that repeatedly behave aggressively toward others often receive different treatment from the rest of the flock. For animals once dismissed as little more than noisy scavengers, that's an extraordinary level of social complexity. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery isn't how much individual crows know. It's how information appears to move between entire populations. Researchers studying crow vocalizations across different regions noticed something unexpected. Certain distinctive call patterns didn't remain isolated within a single neighborhood. Instead, similar vocal behaviors gradually appeared in populations located many miles away. Scientists believe this happens through interactions between neighboring flocks. Young birds disperse. Territories overlap. Individuals occasionally move between groups. Over time, information can slowly spread across remarkably large geographic areas. It's not instant communication. It's certainly not some mysterious nationwide network. But it does resemble a chain of cultural transmission. Knowledge passes from one community to another. generation after generation, behavior after behavior. In many ways, it's surprisingly similar to how human traditions spread long before the invention of books or the internet. One person teaches another. That person teaches someone else. Eventually, an idea travels farther than anyone involved ever could. For crows, the process may work in much the same way. Information about food, predators, safe nesting areas, dangerous humans, all gradually shared through countless interactions over many years. It's a reminder that intelligence isn't measured only by individual problem-solving. Sometimes it's measured by how effectively knowledge survives beyond a single lifetime. Toward the end of one AI-assisted analysis, researchers encountered something they still don't fully understand. As more recordings were processed, some statistical patterns became increasingly difficult for the software to classify using its earlier models. That doesn't necessarily mean the birds suddenly changed their language. There are many possible explanations. Seasonal behavior, different populations, new environmental conditions, or simply the limitations of current machine learning systems trying to interpret an incredibly complex natural communication system. Some researchers have even jokingly wondered whether the crows somehow noticed they were being studied. It's an entertaining idea. After all, crows constantly test their surroundings. They experiment. They observe. They adapt remarkably well to changing situations. But there's currently no evidence that they intentionally altered their communication to confuse scientists. For now, that remains an interesting speculation rather than a scientific conclusion. Still, the very fact that researchers can seriously debate questions like these says something remarkable about how our understanding has changed. Not long ago, crows were viewed as little more than clever birds. Today they're recognized as some of the most intelligent animals on Earth. They manufacture tools, solve multi-step problems, recognize individual human faces, pass knowledge across generations, maintain complex social relationships, and communicate in ways researchers are only beginning to understand. Perhaps the greatest lesson isn't about crows at all. It's about us. For centuries, humans tended to judge intelligence by how closely another species resembled ourselves. If an animal didn't speak like us, build like us, or think in familiar ways, we often assumed it lacked sophisticated thought altogether. Modern science keeps proving otherwise. Octopuses evolved intelligence along an entirely different evolutionary path. Dolphins developed complex communication in the oceans. Elephants maintain extraordinary social memories. And crows, using brains no larger than a walnut, continue surprising scientists with abilities few people imagine possible. Maybe intelligence doesn't have a single blueprint. Maybe evolution has been inventing different versions of it all along. So the next time you notice a crow watching from a rooftop, a power line, or the branch of a nearby tree, you'll probably see that moment differently. It isn't just another bird waiting for scraps. It's an animal carrying years of experience, recognizing faces, remembering places, learning from others, passing knowledge forward, watching the same world you are, and perhaps wondering about you just as much as you've started wondering about it. That's what makes this research so fascinating. Not because it proves crows possess a hidden civilization or a secret language identical to our own. It doesn't. But because every new discovery reveals that the gap between human intelligence and animal intelligence is far smaller and far more complicated than we once believed. And if these remarkable birds still have this many surprises left to uncover, one question naturally remains. What else have we overlooked while assuming we were the only species paying attention?